Information Risk with David Loshin, powered by Insight Jam.
David Loshin, welcome back. We are having another episode of the Information Risk podcast. We've been enjoying a great tour through all of the various types of information risk, and today we have a very interesting one. In my cursory explanation, I would say data has consequences, and sometimes those consequences are so far-reaching and vast for both parties that there can be disputes about what is the data of truth and the data of record, and who gets to determine what the data of truth and the data of record is, because the implications are so great. So let's get into it and talk through the data of deforestation worldwide.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am standing, right now in what used to be the beautiful forest of Death Valley. I'm actually just kidding. It is the salt flats in Death Valley, but I chose this because it was aligning with, maybe tongue in cheek, aligning with our topic today, which is this question of deforestation. I'm not going to stand on ceremony and say this is an advocacy for any type of political view, but rather we are trying to analyze the outcomes associated with how a government has opted to take under consideration what their responsibility is in terms of how they want to deal with climate change. And so let me kind of jump into this. The European Union has an upcoming regulation called the European Union Deforestation Regulation. And I'm going to read a little bit about what the background is here and what the objectives are. In last year, about almost a little over a year ago, the regulation on deforestation-free products entered into force. I'm reading from the a European Union website, and of course, as usual, we always provide all the links in the notes. The main driver of these processes is the expansion of agricultural land that's linked to the production of commodities like cattle, wood, cocoa, soy, palm oil, coffee, rubber, and some of their derived products, such as leather, chocolate, tires, or furniture. As a major economy and consumer of these commodities linked to deforestation and forest degradation, the European Union is partly responsible for this problem, and it wants to lead the way to solving it. So here's the meat of the issue. Under the regulation, any operator or trader who places these commodities on the EU market or exports from it must be able to prove that the products do not originate from recently deforested land or have contributed to forest degradation. And the rule is intended, or the aim is to avoid that listed products Europeans buy, use, and consume contribute to deforestation and forest degradation. They want to be able to help reduce carbon emissions caused by EU consumption and production of those commodities, and then address all deforestation driven by agricultural expansion to produce the commodities in the scope of the regulation, as well as forest degradation. So the overall, the tone here is we recognize that a lot of the stuff that we use is the result of manufacturing or production processes that contribute to forest degradation. We don't want to continue to contribute to forest degradation, and so we are going to make a rule that says if you want to sell your stuff, your leather jackets or your beef or your furniture in the European Union, then you have to demonstrate that you are not contributing to forest degradation and deforestation. So that's where we're starting from.
Yeah, and again, I think to my earlier point with regard to data has consequences, you're going to inevitably get, particularly when you're pitting nation state against nation state, you're going to have self-interest and conflict with regard to the implications of data suggesting that one country is deforesting to the point where they are no longer going to be able to participate in certain trade activities, which has implications downstream for the penalized nation state with regard to their private sector potentially, and perhaps even their public sector. They're naturally going to push back and say, and they may well have a good case, that we disagree. Our data doesn't indicate the same issue that your data does, and in regard to that, our data actually shows us in compliance, and we are being treated unfairly. And so, we'll get into it, but then the question is, well, how do we resolve this issue where you have very different interpretations of deforestation data? I mean, obviously, nobody is pro-deforestation. It also strikes me as a remarkably hard thing to measure.
Right. So we're gonna drill down into some of these things. I mean, the first question is, what does it really mean to be compliant with this? And you're right. There are some countries that are, it boils down into a public-private partnership scenario because, let's say I am a cattle rancher in Brazil. My ability to increase the amount of cattle that I raise so that I can slaughter them and sell T-bone steaks and filet mignon to my European customers is contingent upon my ability to get more grazing space. And of course, the approach that they typically take has been to cut down trees and burn the land so that they can turn it into feeding area. So that's the type of thing that happens in the Amazon area, and Brazil is one of those countries that largely occupies that area. So Brazil is going to be one of the key players in this conversation because to their extent, they don't want to impose extra restrictions on their companies in the country to be able to force them to have to limit how they do their business. On the other hand, they're also one of the countries that's in those hinging points that's necessary to really be able to get some control over deforestation because apparently the Amazon basin is one of the largest spaces. And again, I'm not an expert on this, so don't take me. I wouldn't quote me on that if I were me, and I am me. So, but this is what I understand is that that's the largest area that is used for reclamation of carbon dioxide and capture of carbon. So they're going to be a key player in this, and as are other countries in that region. And the concern here is that if you're in a high risk area, so I guess there's this concept of classification that the European Commission applies, which is this concept of risk associated with concerns and imports from high risk countries can enter the market, but they're subject to the same due diligence requirements that are deemed from those countries that are deemed a standard risk, but they're going to need more intensive checks from the enforcing body. So if you are a first world or a developed country and you have your practices in place and you're deemed a low risk or a standard risk country, then yes, you can do your reporting and that will be accepted. But if you are a high risk country, not only, you can do the same due diligence, but somebody's actually going to look at it. This becomes this whole question of measurement. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, there's a lot of questions here. If I'm the developing country, the emerging country who is striving to become a first world country, or even just striving to, advance my nation, and I'm being restricted from doing everything I can for my nation to grow by countries, old world countries, EU, who have deforested that nobody ever put any limits on them when they were running around colonizing the world and putting all kinds of bad things into play, and nobody had any restrictions on them while they were deforesting their lands and
somebody else's lands
and building up whatever they did back in the good old world. And now they're running around shaking a finger at countries that are effectively trying to do the exact same thing for their populations. And that's just, again, that's my head trash, and I need to recognize. But I can sympathize with the emerging country to say, hey, wait a minute, not to mention the fact that, I may not agree with your data and you may have it wrong. Because in the end, what are we talking about here? How are you measuring my deforestation? Like,
Right.
It's my deforestation. It's not yours. It's like, get out of my forest.
So I think, you're hitting on two things, one of which I think we're kind of wandering off the track here,
Well,
because
I do that.
into political, I as much as I may have an opinion about these things, it's the relevance, I think, is more on, I'm a company who's running a business in a particular area. What do I need to do to make sure that I can sell my tires to companies in Italy, as opposed to, like, I don't disagree with what you're saying, but the key point that you did say,
my point is that, I mean, if you are Brazil, it's like, hey, I'm doing what you did for your country when you were emerging at the same places that we are emerging right now, but now you've created this new set of rules that have limitations now on what I get to do that never applied to you when you were doing what we're doing in a different era.
You're absolutely right.
And I would naturally, as the imposed nation state, bristle against that, let alone the fact that I can probably easily counteract your data with my own data that says something completely different. And this is where it gets dicey, because, let's get back on track.
Yeah.
How do you get to data of record?
So that's the key question, which is how do I measure, or how does one measure deforestation? One of the interesting things that I learned while I was doing some research for this was that there's actually, that I am a faculty member at University of Maryland. There's actually a project at the University of Maryland called the Global Land Analysis and Discovery. It's called GLAD, and they have a project called the Global Forest Watch. And here's from the description I'm reading. I'll also get you guys a link. This project is focused on developing global tree cover change data products based on Landsat satellite imagery, which will be available for display and download on the Global Forest Watch 2.0 web platform. There are three main components of this project: produce a Landsat-based global annualized tree cover charge product at 30-meter resolution for the years 2000 through 2012. And that's complete. Once completed, work with WRI, which I don't really know what that is, and its partners and contractors to incorporate and launch the data set on the website, concurrent with publication of blah, blah, blah. Produce annual updates of the above data set for the years 2013, 2014, 2015, and 2016, etc. The alert system will process Landsat imagery at 30-meter resolution as it becomes available on a rolling basis, identifying and displaying a map tree cover change in near real time. UMD will begin by creating and piloting the alarm system for a set of countries or forest regions, and will include some formal validation for rapid eye tasking and characterization for accuracy. So here's one way that quote unquote deforestation could potentially be measured, which is what they're calling tree cover, and measuring tree cover now at 30-meter resolution. So that's one data point, or one set of data points, which is saying here's one location or here's one party who's doing this measurement, and here's what their measurement says. How else could this be measured? Well, other people, other projects that are taking satellite data, and maybe instead of measuring tree cover, measuring some other aspect, or being able to differentiate between trees/forest and grazing land or processed land, or looking at changes over time in terms of the nature of what that looks like. And so that's, this whole question now is how are we measuring what the levels of deforestation are, and who is the level, whose job is it to differentiate between all these different measures to ensure that those measures are believable. And that, I think that's kind of the key point here, which is if we are going to if the European Union is going to assert some law that says we're not going to buy your products if you can't demonstrate that you haven't benefited from deforestation, and I can't get that data, then it's not my fault that I can't report on that. And the European Union has to provide some kind of guidance that says, here's what the yardstick is, or I guess, if you're in the European Union and not in the UK, the meter stick for measuring deforestation. And here's how, it's not just the deforestation, from satellite imagery. It then boils down to this whole hierarchy, which is I can do that from a geographic standpoint, meaning I can look at the pictures of satellite images of the Earth and be able to say this box of some resolution and some square meterage or square kilometerage is not deforested or has not changed or has changed over time. But that doesn't then link it back down to, well, who owns that land? How are they using that land? Who are they leasing it to? Who are the leaseholders or users of that land? How are they, what are they doing with it? How are they making use of it? How are they stewarding that land? So if I'm a small farmer in Australia, it's one thing for there to be data that is covering the land of, the country of Australia and be able to say, here's an area where 5 years ago it was forest and today it's not forest, but then it's got to get linked down to, okay, well, there's 5 farmers who are farming in that area, and each one of those farmers is running a, cattle production, and those all are some contractors to some much larger food distributor that is collecting that food and processing it, packaging it up for export. So we've got that company, we've got the smaller companies, we've got the government getting involved, we've got NGOs that are involved because they're the ones who are analyzing this data, and you got this whole ecosystem where everybody's got to trust that everybody else is saying the same thing. And I think that's where we're going to start getting into, that's where the gap is going to start.
In this article, it's, I think, Yale University, they refer to this dispute between 2 sources of data, Global Forest Watch and Global Forest Resources Assessment. And in this particular case, they paint 2 very different pictures of what's happening. One paints a very gloomy picture. The other paints a less bleak picture, because in the latter, they are taking into account reforestation, which in the former apparently they aren't. And reforestation obviously is a factor, as we well know, in the United States, where there is very much concern around forest management and recovering from logging and forest fires and so forth, and the efforts to regrow forest through very specific projects. It's inevitably going to be a mess, and so where do we get to a point where there can be some source of truth and an arbitration? I mean, my data says things aren't as bad as your data, and yet you're basing your decisions on your data, and I'm suggesting you should be basing them on my data.
Right. So you're kind of teasing, what we're going to talk about in the next section. But there's one other thing that I just want to say, which is the, if when we first started our podcast 12 episodes ago, we talked about the different types of risks, and one of the risks was financial risk, and one of them was compliance risk. And this is an example of the intersection of both of those. And because the inability to be compliant creates this huge risk of not being able to sell your product in, I'll be off by an order of magnitude. If I say multi-billion-dollar market, probably a multi-trillion-dollar market of goods and services in the European Union. And so if I'm producing product and I'm expecting to be able to sell it to any of those countries in the European Union, and because two organizations that are tracking this are giving conflicting data, then that's impacting my company and my ability to generate revenues. And yet, to what extent is there something that I can do from my own, from within my own administrative domain to be able to address this? So maybe we will take a break and we'll cycle back on some of this in a little more detail afterwards.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's take a break, and when we get back, I'll get back up on my soapbox and start haranguing this whole data of truth issue.
Solutions Review is inviting you to join InsightJam.com. What started a few years ago as a social media event to celebrate enterprise technology has now grown into an always-on tech community with live events, discussions, videos, vendor showcases, and industry resources. Our vetted roster of experts, thought leaders, and analysts are sharing tips and tricks daily. So if you're interested in getting involved, join the long list of companies and brands who have already participated by visiting InsightJam.com today.
All right, David. So we have two sets of data. We have conflict. How do we get down to starting to sort through that? And is there a way? Is there an effort being made? Can you walk us through a little bit about what you're learning?
You appropriately referred to this article, the Yale article that I'd sent you, and about how fast is the world losing its forests. And you're right, there are two main data sources for tree loss, or for measuring tree loss. One is Global Forest Watch, which is compiled from satellite images by the World Resources Institute, a Washington think tank. It paints a gloomy picture of the decline in tree cover. And this article is from 2018. So when it says last year was 2017, it's 72.6 million acres, almost 50% more than in 2015. So that source is saying that the decline in tree cover is accelerating. And they say the other main source for deforestation data is Global Forest Resources Assessment, FRA, which is compiled from government inventories by the Rome-based UN Food and Agriculture Organization. And they are less bleak. It estimates the annual net loss once forest regrowth is taken into account is barely a tenth as much, 8.2 million acres. So that's an order of magnitude difference. And so this article or this paper refers to a bunch of articles that Peter Holmgren wrote for Forest News. There are articles that are titled, the titles are, Can We Trust Country Level Data from Global Forest Assessments? Another article is about one number to rule them all. This third article is actually the same as the first article, so I'm not going to refer to that. But the point that he wants to make is that he actually did a comparison, this gentleman, and he examined the country level data that was produced by both of those sources, and then did a categorization of the differences. So he broke that down into I think he did 5 categories. Category 1 is where there's complete contradiction, and these are where FRA shows a stable or increasing forest area, whereas GFW reports major tree cover losses. It includes countries like Australia, Canada, China, Finland, Gabon, India, Malaysia, Russia, Sweden, and the United States, representing about half of the world's forests. And so according to FRA, there was a total gain of 2.4, I guess, whatever the measure is, MHA per year. And according to GFW, it was a total loss of 9.6. There is an explanation for this, that countries show large tree cover losses from timber harvest, but forest areas normally not affected by the harvest as the land use remains forest. So that let's say if you are foresting, which is cutting down trees, and you're cutting down trees in a forest which is intended to cycle around and regrow trees. So they'll cut the trees in this area of the forest while they're planting new ones in some other, and then 20 years later they'll come around to the place where they had planted those, and they will cut down those trees while the ones that they had cut down 20 years ago are growing somewhere else. So that land area is maybe overall is actively being replanted. So some of those areas you get a loss in tree cover in one chunk, but you get an increase in tree cover over time in another chunk. So that is because those two different organizations are using different measures as to what is used to determine what deforestation or how deforestation is measured.
This to me is the conundrum of data, because you can use data as a snapshot in time, and if you just stop time, there are less trees because the other ones haven't grown yet.
Right,
that you've already planted. I mean, it's a perspective that is a legitimate, if that is the concern, that is a legitimate concern. And more to the point, I think we all have kind of grown up, I think, in the United States anyway, with this take a tree, plant a tree story that we've been told is happening throughout our country. I mean, I think we all have seen the video of the ranger with those little saplings moving through the deforested area, planting away wildly, and that was what the forest rangers did, as far as I can remember. And I got to believe that best practice, which we certainly have implemented, is as a best practice worldwide. But in fairness, if you're only looking at it in an isolated snapshot, then you won't see that.
Right. But I think, what's interesting, and, I always say this, is that, I say it because I'm a data guy, but every problem is a data quality, every business problem is ultimately a data quality problem. And everybody's data quality problems are ultimately the same problems, whether you're in banking or other financial services or insurance or in oil and gas or in, manufacturing. Everybody's got problems, and they all think that their problems are unique to their company or even unique to their industry. But in reality, the problems are all the same problems. And this is an example of, if I recall, we spoke about this whole concept of semantic harmonization a couple of episodes ago, or maybe it was last episode, where it was, the whole question as to what are the definitions that are being used, and are there different terms that are being used, and are there different measures or collections of data that are being interpreted in ways that are different according to who the user of that data is. And I think that this is kind of where we are, because I've got another article here from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, which is that organization that I think is the source for not the GLAD organization, but that second data source. And this is an article that talks about supply chain and the production capabilities. So here's an example. It talks about the production, say, of furniture, the production of tires. Well, you've got farmers who are small actors in this, and you got a lot of those, and you've got plantations or estates that are supervising what some of these farmers are doing. So you may have I'll use the term sharecropping. It's probably not the right term, but there's large farm owners who are leasing their land to smaller farmer organizations that are using the owned land. And then there are cooperatives, especially in farming, where they share resources like machinery or storage or silage or that sort of thing. So those are organizations that are kind of community organizations. And then you've got the plants where they're actually doing the production. So I've got 20 farmers working on land that is owned by one particular company. They're all growing soybeans. They're collecting they're sharing, all that stuff. Then they give the soybeans to the owner of the land. The owner of the land goes to a cooperatively used plant where all the farm owners in Northeast Iowa use, and there they run their production of how to turn soybean plants into soybean food, and then it gets packaged and shipped. So then it goes to this other part of the supply chain, and there's some further processing that's being done. So like those soybean chips that you buy in those big bags at Costco, that's where that kind of comes from. So those manufacturers, food processors, and then that gets shipped out to the retailers, who are then try to sell it in your local supermarché in France, right? So there's all these organizations are involved there. Oh, that woodpecker seems to be attacking us over there. So pay no attention.
Well, at least you have a tree.
Yeah, pay no attention to that sound coming.
Doesn't look like there are any trees around you,
but there's two key problems here from a data perspective, which is data interoperability and standardization and semantic interpretation, because you've got this entire supply chain that's involved in this whole process. And to be able to do this reporting of compliance with the rule, all these people have to be sharing data, up and down that chain. And there, according to this article, there's little coordination and synergy across efforts to collect, manage, and distribute geospatial data. The lack of interoperability has consequences, limiting collaboration between stakeholders along the value chain, which then raises costs and makes it harder for companies to comply with the regulation. So the reason there is they don't talk to each other. Even if they did, there's a few or no data standards which impacts them, and then there's a whole question of trustworthy data sharing to make sure that if I'm a farmer, I don't necessarily want to share everything that I'm doing with the farm owner because they might share it with my competitor. So I don't want to do that either. So there's this whole trustworthiness. There's this whole the need to be able to do data protection. There's need to have transparency, but also traceability. But then there's this whole other issue, which is definitions and classifications. And they even raise this as one of the sections in this article. When is a forest a forest? Where does a forest start and end? How do you define and quantify forest degradation? Current data on land cover and land use is produced using definitions that can differ significantly across countries, institutions, and communities. And that's what we were seeing in that article that I shared with you about Australia and Brazil. And the title of the article is EU's use of incorrect deforestation data, quote, risks blocking imports. Australia and Brazil dispute forest maps and urge Brussels, which is the seat of the European Union, to delay rules that could ban goods entering the bloc. So you had brought this up before. You were talking about the developing nations, or the ones that are on their way to being developed nations, who they're late in the game in terms of stripping the land of all its natural resources and turning it into our beautiful salt flats here, and yet they are being penalized while all the people all the organizations, countries, businesses that were doing it 100 years ago, there's no culpability for them. But here it's not just that indignation about whether it's fair. They actually are saying the data is wrong. And if you're using wrong data, then again, you can't ban our imports because you're using the wrong data.
Well, but I mean, again, self-interest being self-interest. If you're being penalized in a significantly economic way based upon a data set, you will naturally be inclined to come up with an alternative data set that would indicate an alternative reality to make your case. The old story, there are lies, damned lies, and then statistics. Right? And on either side, that can be said. Because in the end, it's the interpretation of the data that is used as the stick in this particular case, the one remaining stick in the forest to sort things out. And when you're talking about significant economic impact, it isn't going to take a self-interested party long to find a data set that counteracts or tells a completely opposite narrative to the narrative that is penalizing you.
Right. Well,
it's human nature.
So that's really what's going on here, which is that, if you are, so you're Australia and you've got all your Australian constituents, which are your businesses that are trying to produce goods and sell them, across, the global landscape. It's to your benefit to make sure that you've got good data. So you're probably got your set of data sources and you believe your own data sources. And if you're the European... go ahead.
And in a modern society, it's in your best interest to manage your resources so that it is sustainable over time. I mean, the notion that Brussels is going to impose again, I can't help but come back to this idea that the people who have already let the horse out of the gate is going to explain to these countries how to get it right. You're going to manage your forests in the way we think you should manage your forests, despite the fact that we didn't manage our forests that way because we basically have already lived through that. and nobody had a chance to, arbitrate their usage of their natural resources. I think if you're the countries on the other end of that decision, you're naturally going to bristle at the idea that this country is going to tell you what to do, but B, that their statistics are the statistics of record, and then ultimately whether or not you would be so reckless in a modern society to completely mismanage your natural resources to not only the world's negative impact, but to your own country's negative impact.
Yeah. Again, I see you standing on your soapbox, and
I can't help
that's
it.
fine.
It makes me crazy.
I know, but when you said that, I also kind of thought, okay, well, who were the colonizers of Australia? They were Europeans, so it's not like
they don't speak Brazil. They don't speak Portuguese in Brazil.
Yeah, well,
out of coincidence.
Okay, but the other point that you're making is absolutely right, which is that the spokesperson for the Australian embassy in Brussels says that the European Union's map is not a single source of truth, but acts as one possible source of information for their operators and competent authorities to determine if deforestation has occurred. But the Australian people, what they did is they took a map that was done in Australia by Canberra's 2023 Forest of Australia map, and compared it to a map from the EU Observatory on Deforestation. And there's a wildly swinging difference between what EU says is forest or deforested and what Australia says is deforested. So is it, in terms of sovereignty, who gets the right to make the decision that the data is correct? Is it the jurisdiction that is defined in the law that seeks to bar your products, or is it the jurisdiction of where the products are being produced, who might have eyes on the ground better than somebody who's the half of the world away from you? And so I don't disagree with you. I think it raises these questions. And if you look at these pictures, and again, you will potentially get to look at these pictures if you can get access to the article. I went through one portal and was able to get to the article, and then when I tried to link directly to it, it put me behind a paywall. So I might be able to tell you how to get to the article by searching through Google. But nonetheless, the European Union wants to be able to keep your stuff out of there. These countries want to get their stuff in there. And I think maybe now's a good time for a break.
All right, let's take one. And when we come back, we'll get me to calm down a little bit, maybe, and sort out some plans for conflict resolution.
Want more Insight Jam? Follow us on Instagram for exclusive content like a daily dose of best practices and buying advice from industry experts and leading solution providers. Or subscribe to our YouTube channel for long-form highlights from our expert panel discussions. The Solutions Review team is hard at work collecting the best enterprise technology information from around the globe, so don't miss out.
All right, David, let's get on to resolution. So, taking a step back personally, I do appreciate that all parties concerned here are trying to get to the best possible outcome for humanity. I'm sure the EU has grave concerns about climate change and deforestation and the impact there. And so they're trying to come up with a way to create a paradigm to measure and limit, ultimately, and perhaps correct mistakes of the past. And I am sure that the other nations that might be impacted by those measures are just as forthright with regard to not only trying to provide opportunity for their people and businesses and government, but also to create the most sustainable future for their people and the people of the world. And so I have no doubt that everybody's best interests are foremost in this conflict. So how do we get everybody into a happy place and start to normalize the data, I guess, across these complex conflicts?
So that's a good jumping off point, and then also we were talking during the break. I need to clarify where I'm actually standing. It's called Badwater Basin. It's part of Death Valley. And no, it wasn't really a forest. It was actually the bottom of a lake, or maybe even the bottom of a part of the early in the history of the Earth ocean, where so the salt is actually the salt that was in the salt water. So just had to clarify that.
Yeah,
so
that's not what the world is going to look like if we cut down all the trees. That's what
No,
happens when
no,
the water
yeah.
goes away.
Exactly. So I'm glad we cleared that up. Your point is a good one, which is I don't think anybody in any government is intent on increasing the amount of deforestation, and that or doing anything that would contribute to things that could impact climate change, or anything like that. I don't think anybody wants to, the same way you don't want to see, the fisheries collapse, or you want to see the extinction of things that are beneficial to people without being able to manage it sustainably. So that's not really the issue. The real issue here is, how do you get to a point where there's, as was referred to in that other article, you've got traceability and you've got transparency, and so you can get to this point where everybody agrees on what the definitions are and what the measures are and how the measures are being done and how they're being interpreted and how they're being produced and how they're being presented, so that there's not disagreement about it's not a question of Australia or Brazil claiming that they're not deforesting as much as the European Union says, but rather that both of those organizations or governmental jurisdictionary authorities are agreeing that what Australia says is corroborated by what the EU says, or the other way around, or that they agree to use the same techniques. And that becomes kind of a different story. And the story that I read in a couple of papers, an interesting, concept, which was being able to do data quality when it comes to remotely sensed forest maps. And the real question there is what does that mean? It means having better standards. It means having agreed to definitions and agreed to semantics, so that the interpretation is consistent across different organizations. But it also means putting the policies and practices in place to ensure that the data that is being collected in a high quality way, that is being stored in a high quality way, that it's being managed, that it's being shared appropriately, that the information associated with the metadata of that data is being shared, so that we don't get caught in the web of semantic misinterpretation. And so that if there's missing data, that there's a way of either agreeing on the imputation of that missing data to what it should be, or that there's a way of going back and getting the data, or finding another source that can be used to fill that data. I mean, really, it's just identifying what the data quality issues are in the data supply chain, and then be able to put together a governance framework that is agreed to across, it's not just across the governments, it's horizontally across the different governments that are involved, and then vertically across the supply chain for the organizations that are producing product, so that when those definitions are, and the semantics and all that have been agreed to, that's communicated down to the base level, so that if there is a question about whether a remote sensing satellite imagery process says that this particular acre of land was deforested, that you can hand that back to the government jurisdiction where that land mass was, which then can send it down through that hierarchy to all the organizations that are involved, to be able to gather, boots on the ground, eyeballs on the ground, data that's either corroborates that determination or provides a contradictory view that satellite determination was not done correctly.
And I think it also is, this is an evolving data collection science. The idea that we've been able to take highly accurate satellite imagery consistently over decades is just not reality. I mean, we haven't really been able to do that. We've got some satellite imagery, but the idea that it's highly accurate in terms of how you can determine where, like you said earlier, where forests begin and forests end and what is deforestation, that all should be agreed to. And then over time, once you've agreed, what are they going to, I think, and that's part of it, right, is you need to recognize, okay, this dispute is legitimate. So we first need to agree on the data gathering first and foremost. And then we can see over time, if we've all agreed, you're always going to have conflict if you don't agree on the data that you've gathered to begin with. I mean, there's just there's no way to agree once you've given up on, your data and my data are just fundamentally different inputs. You have to at some point say, do we all agree that this is how we're going to begin measuring? And if we all agree with that, then we can get to some level of understanding and then manage against it, right? I mean, if this is how they're measuring, then manage against it. But all of a sudden drop a measure in and say, this is how we've been measuring it, and this is the first time you're hearing about that. That's a little, seems
right,
a little
you've got to have
inequitable.
well-defined criteria. I mean, really, here's the thing, okay? Both of those data sources that we refer to, the maps that they create are created from satellite images, and the satellites are way up in space, and what are they doing? They're taking images, but there's all sorts of potential data quality problems that are going to crop up from that, because maybe the sensors are working correctly, maybe they're glitching a little bit, maybe you've got clouds, and the clouds are providing you with a different way of interpreting what's there.
And
the resolution is not great.
What's the resolution rate? I mean,
but even with the images from today, can you accurately pinpoint the height of the trees, to the level to be able to make a determination that there's trees and the trees are indeed higher than they were a year ago?
This is the thing. I think you can now. I think you honestly, with where we're headed, I think you can. I think resolution is getting higher. I think satellite technology and the ability to launch satellites is far greater than it was. I think the idea that you can go back in time to past data, decades of past data, to make this tracking determination is a little open for dispute. But again, if you can all agree that, look, we're going to use these types of satellite gathering, we're going to use this type of software to interpret the data, we're all going to agree on when that data is gathered, how that data is gathered, and as it's gathered, we're all going to agree that those were good inputs into this agreed upon data model, then over time, I think you're going to have people managing their forests in accordance with delivering the best possible data outcomes for their constituency.
Well, yes. But one of the things I want to point out is that to be able to do this the right way, you've got to have some good practices. And fortunately, I came across an interesting article or paper. It was, where was this published? It was published in some workshop proceedings. Again, I'll give a link to everything. But the paper is talking about the data quality associated with forest change analysis and being able to identify whether there were changes in the forestation. And what these guys do is one of their conclusions is that estimates of canopy height can identify parts of the forest change map that are 3 times more likely to contain errors than a random sample. What they are contributing in their paper is identifying, describing the data quality issues that are associated with these types of data sets, and then proposing and evaluating methods that allow you to identify the errors in the annual forest change calculations, which might be a good start to be able to then go back to these different data providers and say, okay, here's, your conclusion is this percentage of deforestation. And as we were referring to before, Peter Holmgren's articles, show that there are some examples where there is a massive disagreement between what is deforested or reforested. Well, these are the types of things that you want to go in and say, okay, well, first, before we start believing one data set or the other, let's apply these data quality rules. I'll boil it down to make it a little easier. Where's their data where there might be some sensor noise or miscalibration? Where's there issues with the temporal resolution because we're looking at pictures that were taken at two different times, but they were glommed together by the satellite company. Maybe there's spectral mixing or spectral confusion, and then be able to then say, well, in these cases where we see this type of situation, there is a need for the government of the country where the image is being taken. They need to come up with ground truth. They need to send a team out to attack. If we've got a question that is showing a significant discrepancy between all of the ways that we are trying to measure this, send somebody, get in a Jeep and drive out there and actually take pictures. And, I know it's not the automated method that we want, but it'll help lead to those situations because, again, I'll go to one of your other favorite topics, which is the creeping inclusion of AI into everything. If we have these capabilities to be able to say, I've now identified where there's a discrepancy between data source A and data source B, and here is ground truth images that are allowing me to make me as an analyst to make a determination that in this case data source A is correct, data source B is not. Then I can take all that and I can feed that into a machine learning model or even put all the pictures and images into a generative AI environment and then allow it to make predictions and say, okay, 95% of the time where I see this type of discrepancy, the root cause is X, and so we're going to lean towards saying it is not deforested or maybe the opposite. But we've got the opportunity to start leveraging all the different types of technologies that we can, but we can't do that if we can't figure out where the root cause of the problems are in the data in the first place. So that's where instituting a data quality program, maybe putting together some data quality standards, some data definition standards, some data sharing standards, et cetera, as a way of smoothing out the differences that are occurring because we've got different organizations that are presenting their own data.
Well, and I think you're right. I think part of the problem is that there are organizations that have decided, and I think, it's universally decided that climate change is a problem. And as a result, organizations have been very aggressive at trying to then determine through data collection or from data that was never designed to, satellite imagery on deforestation, the satellite imagery that they're getting was not designed to determine forest deforestation. That was not its intent. And there's a rush, I think, in again, with all the best intentions, to try to make a determination of the impact that is having on sustainability and climate change issues, but in a way that is potentially punitive to other parties, but also maybe just a little premature. And as a result, you end up with what could potentially have a negative impact on the best intention, which is you can't trust any of this stuff because, the rush to get some data out there, it results in data that is potentially untrustworthy, and you slow the credibility of the best intention program of creating climate change sustainability by rushing out data that really needs a little bit more, agreement and forethought. And I think that's one of the implications as well, is that in your rush to create data that can report against a very important topic that that was gathered in means that was never never its intention, can ultimately hurt the ultimate intent of the initiative.
Well, so thank you. I always love it when you hit the nail right on the head, which is, we boil it down to this whole point of, what is happening here? Well, what's happening is data is being collected for one purpose and is being used for another purpose. And the people who are using it for that other purpose are making some determinations and assumptions about the usability of that data for that particular purpose, without having the administrative oversight or control to be able to adjust how that data is being produced. And so they are on their own until they can, fly up to the International Space Station and put their own cameras there, which they actually do. I mean, that is, they're constantly bringing stuff up there and changing what you can do, because they are making this determination that, we are trying to solve a problem with what we have. What we have is insufficient to solve that problem. Here's some mechanics that we can change to get better data to be able to solve that problem. That's a reasonable thing to do. And so what you're saying is basically we need to be better at doing that, but we need to be able to have that communication go across all the different jurisdictions and administrative domains that are interpreting that data. And here we've got this really complicated web because it spans many nations across the entire the world. We should call it the world. We've got many organizations and companies and different partnerships within each geographic, geopolitical jurisdiction, and they all have to share data, and they all have to agree what that data means. So what you're saying is perfect. Let's figure out how we can figure out what data we actually need, determine if the data that we've got is sufficient to meet that need. If it's not sufficient to meet that need, let's do two things. We'll define what sufficiency means in terms of a bunch of data quality controls and assertions. And then we will figure out how to get the right data. And if we do that, well, that's the same answer to everybody's data problems.
That's exactly it. The stakes are high. I mean, we are talking about sustainability for the entire globe. We are talking about generations and generations to come, having a livable world. And so we need to get this right. And I think it only is a disservice when we rush to conclusions with using data that can easily be disputed and create this doubt about what's actually happening by allowing other data to be presented in opposition to what we're all trying to get to, which is creating a sustainable world. And so, when the stakes are high, you need to have the best possible data science, the best possible data governance, the best possible data gathering and data modeling. And in a crass transition, when the stakes are high for your own business, that's when you call a guy like David Loshin to sort through it, because in the end, this is something that if it's allowed to be disputed, or if there's a seed of doubt, mistakes can be made, and downstream implications can become quite expensive and potentially quite catastrophic for the world. So, David, once again, always a pleasure. Anybody who needs any help with data governance, data quality, data projects in general, data management, knowledge integrity, and David Loshin, all the contact information is available. Plus, you can also connect with them at insidejam.com and on LinkedIn. Yes?
LinkedIn's always good. So thank you, Doug. As usual, it's a pleasure. And I love it when our topics keep cycling around to the same key issues, especially when you're the one who's bringing it up. So we will keep continuing identifying some of these interesting information risks. If you, as a listener, you've got something you want us to focus on, put it into the comments. We will focus on it, or contact me directly, and we will do a little investigation as well.
Well, thanks, David. Looking forward to the next time we chat.